Hi, everyone. I'm Sonia Norman, and for Friday Fast Facts on Moral Injury, we are so delighted to have this international panel of ISTSS members who are doing work on moral injury in different parts of the world with different populations. And we've come together today to have a conversation and see what we can learn from each other and think about next steps for the field. So thank you all for being here. Sure, do you want to say hi first?
I would love to. It's great to be here today. So my name is Shira McGinn. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work at the San Francisco VA Medical Center, and I'm also a professor at the University of California, San Francisco. And the predominant group that I study is U.S. veterans.
Thank you. How about you, Talia?
Hi, thanks for having me. So I'm Talia Green. I'm an associate professor at UCL in London, and I also spent many years before that living and working in Israel. And I study mass trauma, usually in the context of war, conflict, and disaster, including in high-risk occupational groups.
Wonderful. How about you, Angela?
I'm very happy to be here as well. My name is Angela Nickerson. I'm a clinical psychologist and also a professor of psychology at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. I work mostly with people from a refugee or asylum seeking background.
You, Brandon?
Hello, my name is Brandon Griffin, and I am a staff psychologist with the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs and assistant professor at the University for Medical Sciences, and I'll be representing first responders today.
And Jackie, hi. Do you want to say hi to everyone?
So happy to be here today. And my name is Jackie June ter Heijden. I'm from the Netherlands. I work as a clinical psychologist and senior researcher at an institute called ARC Centrum 45, which is an institute for patients with complex psychotrauma. And I'll be speaking on police officers and military veterans today.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for being here today and taking part in this conversation. So the next question we're going to go through is, how did you come to study the moral injury specifically in the population you study, and what led you to see its importance? Brandon, why don't you go first this time?
Love to. So my work in moral injury really grew out of my interest in studying forgiveness and its association with health. So my background was kind of empirical research showing that when we hold a grudge, it's very stressful on our bodies, and that through forgiving ourselves and forgiving other people, we have better mental health outcomes, lower cardiovascular risk, lower all-cause mortality risk. And for me, there was an application in moral injury, given that there is so much focus on guilt, shame, helplessness, anger in this population. So I really saw an opportunity to apply forgiveness research to improve first responders' mental and physical health.
Great. Shira, how about you?
Thank you. So for me, this work really grew out of my work with veterans, and particularly after 9/11, we were seeing a lot of people come back, and I was working in a PTSD clinic. And I remember specifically there was one medic who I was working with at the time who was really focused on saving people, yet had to kill someone while during the context of war. And in the context of thinking about treatment and how we can help people, this really came to the forefront for me about how we needed to go beyond treating PTSD and really treating people who are struggling with some moral issues that they encountered during the war. So this really led to thinking about not only how to define what we now know as moral injury, but also thinking about how we can expand existing treatments as well.
Thank you. Jackie, do you want to share?
Yeah, I want to tell you a little bit about the Netherlands and how it's organized here. We have a healthcare chain for military veterans, and they have a research agenda. And since about 2015, so about 6 years after the paper by Litz and colleagues came out, they put moral injury on the research agenda to improve healthcare for Dutch military veterans. And my own background is as a clinical psychologist, but also as a theologian. So I was always interested in the existential aspects of psychotrauma. So then we applied for funding that we obtained, I think, in 2018. So first of all, we just wanted to know, how many veterans actually have something that looks like moral injury, really basic things, so that we know if we need to adapt the treatments that we provide for them. And for the police officers, I think is that so much research goes towards military veterans that also usually where the money is, I think, at least in the Netherlands and maybe in the US also. But when you work with police officers, you find that sometimes they are so highly burdened, and maybe even more so than military veterans. Maybe I shouldn't compare, but sometimes we see people who have, been in the profession for 10, 20, 30 years. And there are so many things on a daily basis that are morally burdening for them. So then we really wanted to look at, what is moral injury for this population. So then we had a project for them too. Yeah.
That's great. Talia, how about you?
So I guess like a lot of the rest of the panel, I was initially interested in it through work with military veterans and specifically through former prisoners of war. We were doing a long-term research study on their mental health, decades after they'd been in captivity, and unsurprisingly, moral injury was very much, I think, part of that presentation. But actually, when I really got into doing moral injury work was in the wake of the pandemic, when I was doing work with healthcare workers, and it just moral injury had entered the kind of discourse and public awareness, and everybody was talking about, they were worried that their staff would get, moral injury, and what could they do to prevent it. So we put out some guidance, but also wanted to do some research, like I think lots of other groups around the world. And that expanded also to mental health professionals and people who were kind of working in nursing homes and social workers, and so wider groups. But actually recently most of the work I've been doing has been with religious leaders, which has been really interesting. And I think, again, thinking about the kind of theological, spiritual aspects of moral injury has been really fascinating with them, and I think very salient to the work that they're doing.
Oh, cute. And Angela?
Yeah, so I think like a lot of people here, there was a real clinical impetus for starting my work in moral injury. I can remember a particular client that I saw. I was a trainee. I was brand new. I'd just done my CBT training, and I was working at a refugee service for survivors of torture and trauma. I'm one of my early placements, and I was all set. I had my thought challenging sheets, and I sat down and I was like, let's talk about it. And I remember this person, they were a torture survivor, and he just looked at me and he said, I just don't understand how one human can do this to another human. Mm-hmm. And, I looked at my thought challenging sheets and I thought, what do I do now? It seemed like the tools that I'd brought with me, and I was not very nuanced at this point. I was an early therapist, but they didn't feel like, they really could address the scope of what this person was speaking about, which was really this existential kind of scar and threat. And so I'd always had that in the back of my mind, like, how do our current treatments address this, particularly in a refugee context where it can look a little different? And a few years later, the moral injury really entered the discourse. And so that was really helpful for me to have a bit of a framework to put on this sort of experience that I was seeing with my refugee clients over and over again. And that's really what sparked my interest in working in the area.
Oh, it's so great to hear about the work happening in so many different places with so many different populations that I think really have been understudied to now in terms of moral injury. So the last question I'll ask each of you before we turn to more of a discussion format is, what are some things that are really standing out to you? What are some of the important points around moral injury with the population or populations you're working with? And this might be the kind of potentially morally injurious events they're experiencing, or culturally relevant factors or pressing needs that you're seeing. Talia, why don't we start with you this time?
All right, I've got a few. Feel free to stop me and leave it for discussion. I think understanding what moral injury looks like in groups outside of the military is obviously really important. That there are different challenges and many different groups. I think trying to unpick what that means, and I think particularly there are some occupational groups who their role is actually to help people manage moral injury, among other things. So I am thinking about religious leaders, also maybe mental health professionals and social workers, and it's really part of their identity is helping people navigate these challenging situations. But I think they are very vulnerable to moral injury themselves. So I think understanding what happens when somebody is both experiencing moral injury and helping other people navigate moral injury, and potentially even causing moral injury sometimes themselves, and having to deal with people who feel betrayed by them, by the work that they did, or abandoned or let down. And so I think these are really complex issues to figure out how to help people both help others and also help themselves. And I think there's also a question, especially with occupational groups, about kind of understanding prevention versus management or treatment. And I think obviously, usually it's kind of systemic organizational issues that mean that they're exposed to moral injury. So we can't take responsibility for all kinds of prevention, but there may be things that we can do that help people kind of go in better prepared to encounter those, potentially morally injurious events. And then I think thinking about what to do once they have been exposed, and even once they have experienced or developed moral injury, but want to continue working in their roles. What do we do when actually the workplace continues to expose them and there is no after? So I think these are kind of questions that are particularly relevant for occupational moral injury.
Yeah, thank you. What about you, Angela?
Yeah, I think really some of the things that Talia has spoken about already. I can see the similarities with the populations that we work with. I think one thing when I'm working with refugees that really always strikes me is the pervasiveness of the injustice associated with the refugee experience. So, we're talking about moral injury, we're talking about moral transgressions. With refugees, we often have people who've been exposed to persecution and war in their home country, and then they've been displaced, and maybe they've been held in immigration detention, or they've been incarcerated and had dangerous journeys, and they may have lost people or be forced to leave people behind. And then they might get to a country where they experience discrimination, or they're not given basic resources and so on. And so it becomes very challenging to, I guess, unpack or unravel specific potentially morally injurious events, particularly when we often see this kind of societal structure of moral injury in the context of persecution. So I think the nature of the kinds of moral transgressions refugees experience can be multi-level. But I think another piece to that is also thinking about what the moral injury, that the feeling that a refugee or a person might feel they've transgressed important morals, and how that might differ a little bit, for example, with some of the work that's been done in the military. For people who've been through, war, and people who've, as civilians, people who've been through persecution, these are really awful situations, and they often leave people faced with impossible choices, right? So you might have people who are forced to leave family members behind in very dangerous situations, all the way up to forced perpetration in the context of torture, in the context of a child soldier. And what does it feel like, for people to live with that, to sit with that, to feel not only that they have had these huge moral transgressions enacted against them at a societal level and an individual level, but also to carry with them the feeling that they could have done something differently, maybe when they couldn't have. So I think all of these things mean that moral injury in the context of people from refugee backgrounds is really complicated, and it's often multi-level. And I think that, the third very brief point is to say that it also interacts with culture. Morals obviously are going to differ across cultural groups in broad ways when we look at individualism versus collectivism, how morals sit within social relationships, but also between cultural groups. And that, again, adds to the complexity. And it means that we're not always sort of comparing apples with apples, and we have to take a really nuanced approach when studying this.
Yeah, I'm struck by how much both of you are sort of appreciating the nuances and the many levels involved, with some overlap and some unique features. So I'm excited to come back to that in the conversation. Jackie, how about you?
Yeah, I used to work with refugees, so I really recognize what Angela says. And also sometimes we have refugees in our team, even though it's a team for profession-related trauma, because some of them are military veterans also. So we see them from moral injury from those experiences. What I wanted to say is, I was thinking of what are some of the differences between the United States, mainly where the whole moral injury construct comes from, and the Netherlands. And I think maybe an important difference is that the Dutch military predominantly participates in peacekeeping missions. And they are different from combat missions in that these missions have limited mandates, but often the circumstances are very violent. And one major example that we also studied is the UN Perform mission to the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, where there was a Dutch Bat battalion, part of this mission, and their aim was to see to truce and facilitate humanitarian aid. But this whole mission ended basically in genocide. 8,000 Bosnian men and boys were killed in the end there, and the battalion was unable to prevent it. And one of the studies that we did was of how is the well-being of these veterans 25 years after their mission. And basically what they really report are these experiences of betrayal, feeling betrayed by the UN, feeling betrayed by the government, and this tremendous sense of powerlessness and impotence. And I think that may be a little bit different. For example, when you compare the work that we did with the work of Shira of impact of killing, for example, which I think maybe has different themes. And as I was going to say a little bit about police officers also, is that in police officers, we do find that moral injury is really an issue. Sometimes it's not like everything that they experience meets the A criterion of, death or serious injury or sexual violence. But sometimes it's related to the work environment or the police culture that they find really burdening, or they witness colleagues doing things that they think are morally unjust. And some, are exposed to all these A criterion PMIEs, but they do not develop moral injury. They have an ability to hang on to their own sense of what happens, and they can emphasize their own limited role and responsibility. But then we also have this group who feel really overly responsible for people's deaths, even though sometimes they were, completely unable to prevent it. And there's this real shattering of control. And I think maybe it's related to the Dutch culture, in the sense that one of the typical things about the Dutch, I think we are one of the happiest peoples in the world. I think Dutch children, for example, are always, they rate very highly in happiness. And I think it comes with the sense of, everything will be okay and nothing is a big deal. And this is Dutch saying that you just act normally. That's crazy enough, right? But then when these things happen, of course, it is a big deal. And so I think there's this huge shattering of expectations that might be a cultural thing. I think if we had more adverse events, maybe earlier on in life, maybe our expectations would be different. And we have these police officers who think, here I am, I'm going to solve this, and then they can't. And it just breaks at some point after all these events, it just breaks them, I think.
That's such an interesting perspective. That makes a lot of sense. Brandon, do you want to go next?
Sure. I think I want to pick up that thread that Jackie highlighted about organizational culture. Most of my work in moral injury started with veterans who had been separated from the military for some time. And so moving into work with first responders who were still engaged with the organizations where the moral injury occurred, or continuing to do that work, it brings up opportunities for addressing modifiable aspects of organizations that could affect moral injury, doing some prevention work. But I think the piece that stands out to me, working with American first responders in particular, is that we acknowledge that a lot of the institutions and organizations to which we belong have caused harm. And in many cases, it seems that first responders are wrestling with how complicit am I in harm that might be caused by other members of my organization or the organization at large. And so trying to understand that more collective piece of moral injury, particularly when a first responder, what I hear from many first responders is, when you put on the uniform or the gear, it's not just that I am a firefighter or I am a police officer, but I represent firefighters or law enforcement personnel to this entire community. And so do the other people who are part of the force. And so that interaction between the individual in the organization, I think is so important when addressing moral injury in first responders.
Thank you. And Shira.
Thank you. So I'm gonna, there's 4 or 5 things I want to highlight, but I promise to be pretty brief about those. So I think one thing that I always try to remember is most of the early moral injury research and research to date has been with veterans, and many veterans with the US, including empirical work and treatment development. So I think I'm very aware of that, and that's why I'm particularly excited about this panel, because I think we really need to expand from that. It's the seed that was planted that has grown, but now we need to also expand it to other populations. I think the other point is that veterans really resonate with the concept of moral injury, and being able to name it provides a way to talk about it. So that's a really key point, that it gives a way for us to create a conversation, create a dialogue specifically with U.S. veterans who are very reluctant to talk about ways in which they're injured in general. The third point is, I think that we know that moral injury is not part of routine care, and so when people come in to get help or to get treatment, moral injury hasn't been on the radar most of the time. And so I think that this is really important too, that what we're doing here collectively is a way to advocate for that and put it on the radar and make it hopefully eventually part of routine care, so that, especially now that we have better ways of measuring it and capturing it, and are starting to develop new ways of treating it, specifically for veterans and other groups. I think that the other piece that's really important to me is that moral injury, from the research we have seen, that it presents quite differently in different veterans, right? So some people may be struggling with the guilt, and that's really what's most burdensome to them. Others, the spirituality is the key issue. And for others, they may really be plagued with more of the functional issues, like the self-sabotaging behaviors or the self-punishment as well. And so I think that that's, noting that this is presenting differently. And I think that our treatments have to really be acknowledging how differently it presents. And then the last point that I'll make is that I think that we absolutely need to learn more about how moral injury shows up in individuals with intersecting identities. So we already know from research with US veterans that there are differences in gender. We've seen also some hints of differences with race and ethnicity as well, and how moral injury presents and how it impacts people who have minoritized identities. So I think continuing to do some of that work is going to be really helpful to us in the future as well.
Thank you all. And there's so many things that are striking across these populations in terms of people who are still in morally difficult situations that can be causing moral injury, and maybe they already have it, and then people who are maybe now safe and out of the context but living with the with moral injury. And so questions of prevention, questions of treatment were raised. Briefly, it made me think I had the opportunity to do some work in Ukraine last month, and I worked with a lot of military folks, but I also worked with people who are mental health providers and medical providers and interpreters. And all of them were working so hard, like 12, 14-hour days consistently. And, each individually, they would say things like, well, how can I not be when my people are out on the front fighting, right? So in some ways, that's almost an internalized prevention method in a way, right? There's lining up their values to, or expressing their values in a way to support, the people who are in acute danger. So it just, I think so many things you all said brought home the many different facets of this. So I'm curious to hear if any of you had strong thoughts or reactions as you were listening to your colleagues, if there's anything you want to share before we move to the questions we talked about.
Yeah, I will. Shira was the last to speak, so it's the latency effect, if that's true.
Yes.
But no, I'm so glad that you said that we are broadening this this topic towards civilians, because I think we were all a little bit hindered in the beginning that all the instruments that were there were all aimed at military veterans, and I think there are so many other groups who have experiences that are very morally injurious. And it also made me think of a remark that you made during at the ISTSS about the issue of what do you think about people who are victim of morally injurious events, if they should be labeled with moral injury. And I was listening to Angela earlier, and she was speaking about this refugee who had been tortured. And I thought, I wonder, Shira, what do you think of that? With an example like that, wouldn't it be a shame if we kept the moral injury label only for people who commit such a thing and not for the people who undergo it? So that was one of the questions I had for you when I was listening to you speak.
Yeah, I think I think this is a great issue to kind of think about and debate. And I think that I'm glad that we're returning to it. I think that there is, right now we're at a turning point in our field, and I think that these issues are critical. So absolutely people are experiencing a lot of pain and a lot of difficulty. And I think the challenge that remains is for us to really um, talk about, just because something is occurring doesn't mean it should be part of a particular construct, right? So I think that the struggle is how we define what is moral injury, how is it different from trauma and PTSD? Are there other issues like, I think betrayal is another great piece, right? So we know that betrayal occurs, but should we really be measuring it as something that's separate, right? And not part of the whole construct of moral injury, or should it be part of moral injury? So I think that there is a lot of, I think we need to do some deconstruction and really understand like what are the key issues here and what are the pieces that we should be attending to. So I think the key for me is for us to be having these conversations and for us to really understand. But I think that the key is that we do work rather than sort of say this absolutely is a part of this construct and it should be measured, because we have to think ahead to the treatments too, right? And so the way that we treat people for experiences, for example, a veteran who has killed in war, a refugee who has struggled with witnessing very challenging things, those look very different, right? And so I think we have to be absolutely having these conversations. And for me, the key is like looking downstream and making sure that our definition of moral injury aligns with how we are thinking about measurement and also with treatment. And the worry that I have is if we group too many things together, it becomes incredibly murky, right? And so I think our challenge now is to really be thoughtful and extremely aware of how the different constructs may hang together or may not hang together, and really need to be acknowledged as important yet deserving of their own treatment and their own measurement. So I'll kind of leave it at that, because I think we need to do a lot more discussion and a lot more debate. My only thing is that I don't want us to change a whole definition that's been defined one way without more discussion, without more thought to the topic. So I'll let others respond as well.
I also wanted to pick up a couple of things that actually everybody said, but just thinking about these different groups or populations that we are interested in. And obviously, apart from Angela, most of us talked about various kind of professional, occupational groups. But I actually think it's worth thinking about what happens at the kind of population level. And obviously, the world has not been very stable for a long time. And I think people are still kind of recovering from pandemic and conflicts across the globe and trying to grapple with that. And I think a lot of people, Brandon mentioned about feeling complicit, and I think lots of people are feeling that. And I think there's a lot of kind of what choices do people have in this situation. I think that's really impacting. It's kind of a moral injury type presentation where people feel that there are things that they are doing or that they should be doing or that they see other people doing. And that can be far from where they are. And so I think just trying to get at what this means at a kind of societal and population level, and not just focusing on these groups that we know experience moral injury, but really exploring what that means more generally, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, just to pick up a little on some of the points that have been made that particularly Shira and Jackie were speaking about this issue of definition and conceptual clarity and overlap. I think it's a real challenge in the field. We have moral injury as kind of a construct that has been considered as an experience, a mechanism, and an outcome, sometimes all in the same study, right? We have constructs that are very overlapping. We have complex PTSD, we have depression, we have anger, we have guilt, we have shame. And I think that makes it really hard. And I think once you start broadening out to other populations, civilian, for example, but also then other cultures, starting to define a syndrome based on a very specific set of symptoms that may not be relevant or may not be a good indicator of distress or functional impairment after a potentially morally injurious event becomes really hard. We've taken a different approach to many other people in the way that we've researched moral injury, where we've really looked at it as a mechanism, as sort of a cognitive factor. So if you go through an experience and rather than just experiencing, say, life threat, and thinking, I was really in danger then, something, I could have died, there's a moral component. This transgressed my morals, or I transgressed my morals, that this can then lead to a whole variety of sequelae, whether that be fear-related sequelae or anger or shame or guilt and so on. And I think through that approach, that's allowed us to not necessarily nail down one specific set of symptoms that is going to relate to everyone. And I recognize that's very different to how other people have done it. And there's a lot of value in the way it's being explored more broadly. But I think one thing that it's really led us to that's really important, I think, is the social functioning piece. That for many of our clients, particularly now we've delved into therapy, we've developed an intervention, we're testing it. Really, the thing that is, for many of our clients, that is really the most pervasive impact of these experiences and these moral injury appraisals or outcomes or whatever we want to call them, is how it interferes with their ability to connect with their community, to have relationships with their family, to trust institutions. And, we started with a very cognitive focused intervention, and over time it's evolved. So there's still a significant cognitive component, but much of it now is very socially oriented, because for people to recover from these experiences, which ultimately are impairing their capacity to move through, the social world in the way that they want to, that might be a starting point that we have to think about to help them repair that. But I'd be very interested in other people's thoughts on that.
I think for me, the forgiveness research is actually fairly instructive in this area. I haven't worked with refugees myself, but I've done a good bit of work with people who've experienced intimate partner violence. And I can say that one of the most contentious issues in forgiveness research is, should a person who's experienced violence at the hand of a romantic partner forgive? And there's all these questions about what's the difference between, forgiving when it happens in your own skin and it doesn't involve reconciliation with a dangerous partner or something like that. But as it relates to the question of betrayal and moral injury, for me, it seems that these issues are so complex, and we can't just link moral injury to this population or that population. And the reason is because moral injury often is nested within betrayal. And so, like, I think with these intimate partner violence survivors, you get the betrayal by the partner, but then, and for me, that's betrayal trauma, and then when systems don't support them like they should, that's institutional betrayal. But there are occasions where someone's child might be affected, and then they wonder, did I stay? It was one thing when I was impacted negatively by my partner, but now my child has been impacted. And so this person has both been the victim, but also feels like they made some mistakes that caused harm to befall their child. And so I see institutional betrayal trauma as one trauma type, PTSD being another, the life threat piece, moral injury being another, and they can all kind of co-occur in different configurations because trauma is so complex.
I'll just jump in, and I think that one of the things that I would love to see is us deconstructing these things, in empirical studies, the way that Brandon is kind of articulating, because I think that it is something that we can look at empirically, right? Like, do people who have betrayal trauma versus what we're now defining as moral injury, again, and versus PTSD, does that behave differently, right? So to Angela's point, like, does that look different in terms of like social functioning and the need to intervene socially? Does that look different in terms of like downstream functional outcomes? And I think by doing some of that kind of deconstruction and dismantling work, we can see how that looks differently in people. And then we can come to some decisions about the construct and the definitions. But until we do those kinds of studies, I think there's a risk of, having everything hang together as moral injury, because then we can't get nuanced about how to measure and treat and help people. And so that's my concern. And the studies that I'd love to see sort of moving forward.
Yeah, Jackie.
I think that's a great challenge that you're putting to us. But what I always wonder is, if you go back to the source and you read Jonathan Shea, I always think he never intended it to be a thing, right? He just said, I mean, military veterans who do not recover from their experiences in war, it's not because of the life threat and so on that they have been through, it's because of the moral injury. I always think there's an emphasis on the first word. It's because of the moral injury that they've been through. And the fact that he doesn't even bother explaining what he really means, to me, means that he thought this is like a universal experience that people have. And sometimes, it's less pervasive, and maybe it's like a moral bruise or a moral scratch on your knee, but sometimes it's really like an injury. So that's always how I think about it. And for me to read it that way makes it more difficult to try and put it into a box, let's say, because then you can't really say, the people the person who was the perpetrator, well, he is morally injured, and then makes you wonder, who injured who. I don't really understand that. But then the person who was injured isn't really, but not morally. I mean, that's sort of, I think that's almost indefensible, even though I absolutely understand your point. You can't put Angela's refugee who was tortured in a treatment group with a military veteran who killed a child because they might be wearing I can't think of the word, but a bomb. It might be having a bomb on their body. It's completely impossible to put them in a group together. We try and put police officers and military veterans in one group. Sometimes even that is difficult, even though some of their experiences are similar. But so I do understand your point, but yeah, I wonder how you think about that.
I could jump. Oh, sorry. Please.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, just to jump in on that point, I think you're absolutely right in that they're different treatment focuses and you don't want to put people together. But the one thing I will note is that we've got empirical data now from a couple of samples, which suggests that amongst refugees, the experience of moral injury self, or having transgressed your own morals, always, always, always comes with the experience of moral injury having others transgressed your morals, which makes sense for the refugee experience, right? Where you're going to be a victim and you're going to probably have had to make some really horrible decisions that are very difficult to live with. And so when we've been working with people clinically, it's hard because often both are presenting at the same time. And you kind of have to figure out where to start, right? Is it the sense of, self-worth that has been eroded by living with the guilt of something that I feel I shouldn't have done, whether that's legitimate or not? Or is it the sense of pervasive injustice and anger around what's been done to me, when both are often present? So I do think sometimes, certainly in the population we work with, that the distinction or the idea that these are two very separate groups of people and separate experiences is not always accurate.
And I think that ties in also with what Shira was saying, that these come together, and where are the lines and where are the boundaries? I mean, I think what the direction this conversation has really gone into me is sort of, we all agree, we all know we don't have a consensus definition yet, and I think we're hitting upon a lot of similarities and some differences. And I know some of you are working with multiple populations who've been through moral injury, and then we're having this conversation, and it seems to me a very unique opportunity, this conversation, to really start maybe articulating some of these similarities and differences, either that you're seeing across your own work or that you're seeing in reading about other people's work, having this conversation today. I'm wondering, Shira raised the point of sort of the cultural context. I'm wondering what you're seeing either as some similarities or differences, or even as a research agenda to really clarify that so we can be as effective as we can in this work we're doing. Go for it, Jackie.
Sorry, it's we're all, waiting for each other, which is a moral thing, right?
We're all nice.
No, I just wanted to say that, let's face it, we're all from Western cultures, right? So we're not that culturally different. There could be the difference just could be so much bigger. But for the Dutch culture, I have always still found the working model of moral injury by Ditz and colleagues tremendously helpful. And I've always felt that it sort of described what my patients have experienced, and I always use it to talk to them about the impact of these experiences. So I think in that sense, the similarities are maybe bigger than the differences, at least for the people that we work with in this Western context. Yeah.
I see what you're saying. One example that strikes me from my own clinical work and training others, case conceptualization I always think is so important. And I find that the veterans with moral injury that I've primarily worked with, there's such an ambivalence about getting better. I'm here in treatment because I know I'm suffering and I want to get better, but also I don't necessarily deserve to get better, right? And that can play out as a lot of I show up, but I don't fully do the work, or maybe I show up sometimes, and so I feel like when I've done training and supervision, kind of helping my clinicians frame it in that context really gives them a nice guide with how to work with that ambivalence over some other interpretations they might be giving it. But I have no idea if that's something that's sort of universally seen across populations with moral injury, or maybe even the way it sort of plays out might be different across cultures. So I'm very curious if you all are seeing anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really major thing. I was using your work today because you have some of these questions, right, in your book about how can you discuss this with people. And I think especially for people who have done something that they don't agree with, it makes it so uncomfortable for them to be in their own skin. And so you want to sort of have the treatment pave the way back to themselves also. Angela was speaking about, they have to reconnect with others, but they also have to, muster, have the courage to go back inside, right? And feel what they feel and so on. I think the motivation phase in the treatment is really important. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thinking again about the kind of religious leaders and faith leaders and the role of faith in this. Obviously, there are plenty of people who, faith plays no part in any of this, and so it's not a kind of religious transgression. But I think that there are many people across the world who these things come down to. Also, I did something that really went against the beliefs of, that I hold and that my community holds, and that's deeply distressing, and I think often a big challenge to their own spirituality and faith, which is again very, very distressing. So I think there are groups that it's worth thinking about, how can we draw upon things that they have in their religion or in their culture potentially already that can actually be integrated into the kind of work that's done. And I think that probably works particularly well at a group level. So if you're actually doing something that could be led by a faith leader within the community that draws upon kind of guiding principles and beliefs and that people actually practice on a day-to-day, I think that can be very comforting. But I think there's a lot of work to be done to understand how different groups would want to incorporate that. So rather than people coming from the outside and telling them what their moral injury is and therefore how we resolve it, drawing on their beliefs, I think this is work that must, be done collaboratively and I think would be very helpful, or has been helpful so far.
Yeah, that's true. How much participatory research have we really done with moral injury? And it's such a good point. The whole thing hinges on people's morals and values, and we know that there's a cultural component to that. And yet, as of yet, we haven't really, I don't think as a field, delved into that quite enough.
I think there's also a piece that is so tied to people's identity and who they are, right? So what they did or what they witnessed is so integral to who they are as a person and how they feel in the world, right? And so I think a critical piece of that is if they feel like that sense of identity has been damaged in some way, it's about really getting back to, again, like who they are, what their morals and values are, and like to remind them that what happened is not necessarily, it can be integrated into who they are, but it doesn't have to be all of who they are. And I think that that's a lot of the struggle, right? And so the identity is so culturally based, and it sort of draws from so many different pieces as well, that I think that that's a big challenge across cultures, right? To get back to sort of not only identity at sort of the personal level, but also, as Brandon was kind of speaking to earlier, there's multiple levels of that, right? There's the identity of who you are as a person, but then who you are as part of a culture and as a society, and sort of the rings get bigger as we go out.
I think to pull from something Talia was saying, I think of faith leaders as first responders. And it really just reveals the scale of the need here. Law enforcement and correction personnel who use lethal means, fire personnel or in environmental hazards who make decisions and it affects who lives and dies. Emergency kind of paramedic, emergency medical, officers of the court and other kind of judicial services. In all of these situations, you can do everything right by the professional standards and still walk away with a moral injury. And I think that is so important to the patients that come in our clinics, just because there is a lot of stigma, like what Sonia mentioned. The first responders would tell you that moral injury is absolutely a part of the work that they're doing, and so is help-seeking stigma. And so how do we kind of meet them in that place with peer intervention or other resources that can acknowledge that the technical parts of the training that you receive are incredibly important, but so are the parts of your training that make it so that you can keep doing the job. Like you wouldn't go out without your bulletproof vest on. We also need to make sure that people are well equipped in order to manage the exposure to highly stressful and traumatic events that are a part of their jobs.
Yeah, and I think, I'm just thinking of examples during COVID. I was in the UK and there was lockdown, and there were, like everywhere, there were the public health rules about how you do funerals. And so funerals became massively limited to a very small number of people. And so we'd have examples where religious leaders would have to prevent family members from coming to funerals because the family members have been exposed to COVID. And so therefore they were on lockdown. And, in Muslim and Jewish communities, often the funerals can happen very fast. So people weren't allowed to come to the funerals. They weren't allowed to do the purification of the body, which is kind of central practices, and can be, so people were basically being buried not in the proper way. And religious leaders were having to enforce these rules. So they felt that they'd kind of transgressed their own kind of religious beliefs. They were also betraying and abandoning the members of their community by not allowing them to mourn the way they wanted to mourn. And they were following the rules, as you said, there's a kind of the public health rules. They were just upholding the law. But it was so complex. And there were times when religious leaders kind of created stricter rules than the public health. And that was really, really damaging for their relationship with communities. And I think these are things that are really complicated. And, I'm sure in every different group, we can think of the ways these things become very kind of complex and difficult to navigate, because you can't uphold all of your morals and beliefs at the same time often, and you have to pick some over others. And I think that's when it becomes very difficult, because in order to not transgress one set of kind of morals that you hold, you find yourself forced to transgress a separate set of morals. So I think trying to think about how we help people sit with that, it's the kind of comes back to Angela's impossible choices, but there were, a moral injury was almost inevitable. It was just which one was it going to be? And I think helping people process that is probably a big challenge.
One of the things that I've really appreciated about this conversation is that each of you bring a clinical voice that's incredibly insightful and a research perspective and sort of just this really kind of stepping back and thinking about where we are, and I imagine where we should be going. And I think some of that has come out in the conversation. We have about 5 minutes left. Would you guys be okay if we kind of went around like we did in the beginning and maybe said any final thoughts? And also, if you had your magic wand, what do you think are the key next steps, whether it's in terms of research or in terms of, figuring out how we think about this whole issue that's, just so complex, as you guys have pointed out so beautifully. Anybody want to go first, or?
I can go first. I think Shira's comment about moral injury work not being a part of routine care yet stands out to me. We know from the discipline and implementation science that once a practice becomes evidence-based, it can take up to about 17 years for it to be integrated into care. So I think there is immense opportunity and need for collaboration and more effort in these areas to try and speed that up, to get these assessments and treatments available to the people who need them. For me, one of the things that stand out is there's never going to be enough resources. And so using a stepped care model is really important, to try and put the targeted resources as best you can. And I think as a psychometrician, assessment is a huge part of that. And so one of the other Fast Friday Facts or Friday Fast Facts that we did was on the moral injury and distress scale. And that's one of several similar scales that are available for assessing moral injury exposures and outcomes, but figuring out where we can put these kinds of assessments to identify not only the people who were exposed to potentially morally injurious events, but those who are having a functionally impairing level of symptoms because of that, and making sure that we are getting those folks to targeted treatments as quick as possible.
Thank you, Brandon. Angela, would you like to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think as the clinician and researcher in me, I think it would be incredibly useful to be looking at more of a mechanistic level and trying to understand the processes by which these experiences give rise to these, social outcomes, to these mental health outcomes, to the functional outcomes, so that we can really target our interventions and start to unpack some of the differences that Shira was speaking about before. But I think from the advocate in me, which is always somewhat close to the surface, funnily enough, I think there's a bigger piece here as well. So we've done some research recently, which has looked at the impact of human rights violations or institutional rights violations on mental health, on moral injury, and found that, not surprisingly, there is a pervasive impact on that. And so I do think there are structural aspects to this that, while as clinicians we want to work with the individual to help them recover from these awful experiences, there are aspects of these awful experiences that maybe at a policy level need to change. So if we've got a refugee who's fleeing persecution and war, and then we lock them in a jail for several years, that's going to cause moral injury, and so there's also the advocacy piece in using the work that we're doing to advocate for systems and structures and policies that really support people in terms of well-being rather than create moral injury.
Thank you so much. Such good points. Jackie?
I wanted to say I really enjoyed this conversation. I've read all of your papers, of everybody who's present here, so I really enjoyed, the exchange. And for me, the value of the moral injury concept is that we finally get to talk about guilt in a therapy room. At least in the Netherlands, there was always, this attitude of, this is something for religious counselors, for example, not for the therapists. But now finally, because we have this concept, we can And one thing that still puzzles me and that we didn't speak about today, again, is about the conceptualization, for example, high stakes. High stakes is a metaphor, right? What is high stakes? And I think these are things that would be helpful to get some more clarity on, because otherwise, even though I advocated for, moral injury being a universal experience within psychiatry, you don't want everybody to be morally injured, right? That would be meaningless. So where do we draw the line? Do they need to be a criterion events or not? That's something that I hope we'll get more clarity on maybe in the future.
Thank you. How about Shira, and then Talia can bring us home.
I'm really excited about having more sound measurements so we can look at how this looks different in different cultures, in different countries with different populations. So I think we have a lot more work to do to understand how this might present differently. And so I'm excited about that line of work. I also think something that we didn't get to mention, but is very kind of near and dear to my heart, is just really better understanding people who unfortunately end their own lives because of struggles like these. So we know that those rates are increasing in healthcare workers. They've always been there in veterans. So understanding how moral injury might interface with that, I think is critical as like a public health issue moving forward. And finally, just want to kind of come back to the identities piece and looking at certain minoritized groups. I know that we all have seen that like racism and discrimination impacts people differentially, and so I think just as an example, I worked with a Black veteran who had to make certain calls that ended in people's lives, ending in Somalia. And he was very impacted by that because, he identified with a lot of the people that he observed hurting. So I think we have to really understand how those identities impact people and their concepts of moral injury and functioning moving forward. Passing it to Talia to take us home.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm also just kind of struggling between, on the one hand, as a researcher, my instinct is to say we need better measures and we should really think about how we can identify those with moral injury and help those and think about developing treatments for them. But then the bit in me that also does public mental health thinks that, there are some populations where it's more rare, but there are some populations where people have had such high degrees of exposure to potentially morally injurious experiences. Across the world, there are so many people experiencing conflict right now. And I think, it's really a public mental health issue. And so, I kind of wonder how helpful it is to really be measuring moral injury in those groups when we know that they've experienced moral injury, and thinking about treatments. These might not be feasible. So, certainly at the individual level. So thinking about policies and kind of structural change, but also thinking about interventions that can be developed that could be delivered by teachers and social workers at group level and faith leaders and healthcare professionals and groups that aren't, they're not sitting one-to-one in the therapy room, but really are trying to do group work and trying to understand these experiences and help people make sense of them. And I think that's something we also need to be thinking about.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much for sharing your time and your wisdom and your work with us today. I think this will be a wonderful resource for ISTSS members and the public. And I personally am leaving this conversation wanting to collaborate more with each and every one of you. Thank you all for the work you're doing. And hopefully this will be just part of ongoing conversations we have. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.